For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge shape early 20th century America? Now, our guest, Laurence Jurdem, is an adjunct professor of history at Fairfield University and Fordham College. He is a frequent contributor on American politics to the New York Times, Washington Post, other national publications. He's the author of 2 books, including today's topic, his newest book, The Rough Rider and the Professor, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and the Friendship That Changed America. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I am pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks in the series Topics in American History. LJ, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, Tony, thank you so very much. It's great to meet you. I appreciate it, you touting my work on Twitter, and I encourage you to keep it going. But I'm delighted to be here, and I think all the work that you all do at the Bill of Rights Institute is wonderful.
Great. Well, we're very happy you're on. I'm honored that you joined me. Just as a full reveal and total honesty here, I actually wanted to write this book. Such a magnificent topic. This great friendship, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge. No one, to my knowledge, has ever written an entire book about it. And it's such an important topic. They have 2 very public figures whose careers and collaboration span many decades, including the Gilded Age and the Spanish-American War and expansion of American power, the Progressive Era, the presidency, World War I, and Versailles. I mean, we're going to talk about it all, but just a great topic and a great friendship. So congratulations on the book.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, it was a wonderful book to write. It was a COVID book. I felt very fortunate that I was able to get a duplicate copy of the Lodge-Roosevelt correspondences from the Massachusetts Historical Society. I was able to get them shipped to my home library in Connecticut, and therefore was able to do it. Otherwise, I don't necessarily know if I would have completed the project. So I feel very fortunate. There was some help, maybe perhaps some divine help involved. But it was a fun book to write, and I came to adore both characters, especially Henry Cabot Lodge, who I thought didn't know that much about, but I thought was just a terrific character.
Great. Well, let's jump into the interview. And my first question has to deal with sort of the Gilded Age milieu in which both of them were raised and came of age. So how were Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge shaped by their families, by their pretty privileged social position, by their educations in Gilded Age America?
Well, there was a lot of overlap there, as you sort of suggest in your question. Both men were members of the Eastern elite. They both were graduates of Harvard. They both grew up in tremendous wealth and privilege, and they were both encouraged by their respective fathers, who they adored, to give back in some way or another, very much in the sort of noblesse oblige idea that has become so prominent when we discuss any of these sort of Brahmin types of or elite figures in American history. Lodge and Roosevelt were encouraged to be athletic, to be physical, to be literal in terms of they were given books, they were given stories, they came to love history, literature. The Civil War was a very prominent moment within their background, even though both men were quite young when the war was going on. But within that war, within that conflict, there was these ideas of honor, integrity, bravery, galleance. All of this was sort of put forward in their lives by their respective fathers. And both men came to realize that the only way to truly prove one's mettle was on the field of battle. And this was something that was a very romantic idea, and one that both Lodge and Roosevelt took very, very seriously. Both men were encouraged, as Roosevelt, I think, articulated later on in his speech, The Strenuous Life, this idea to sort of take risks, make an effort, use those qualities that we could call within sort of American history, these ideas of Americanization, this idea of entrepreneurship, responsibility, initiative, creativity, all of the things that the United States was so unique for in instilling within those who were born here and those who arrived from foreign shores. And so this was something that Lodge and Roosevelt took very seriously because neither one of them, especially Henry Cabot Lodge, was suited for a life in politics. Lodge didn't like regular people. He didn't like ordinary people. Which is why it's so marvelous and admirable when you think of how far he was able to get politically, because everything one would think about in regards to politics, kind of the joy of people, the joy of camaraderie, the joy of personal contact. Lodge hated all of that. He preferred to sit in his home in Nahant, reading books, reciting Shakespeare, riding his horse, Toronto, and kind of doing things on his own, or very, very select friends like Henry Adams or Theodore Roosevelt. But both men came from a family where there was this unspoken message about doing something that makes society better. And Lodge believed, based on the fact that his great ancestor George Cabot, who was a close friend of Alexander Hamilton, the first senator from Massachusetts, Lodge believed that it was his destiny to sit at the table of his state or the head of the table of his nation. And he realized when he met Theodore Roosevelt that this was a man who belonged, not only deserved a seat at the table, but demanded to have a seat at the head table. And that's really what this friendship was about, and why Lodge was so responsible in helping Roosevelt become president far quicker, at least I believe, than he would have ordinarily.
Right, and what a great segue into my next question, which relates to that very arena of politics you were just talking about. So, in Gilded Age America, what is the focus of their public service and their politics? I think you talk about in the book them becoming sort of more on the a little bit more on the reform side.
Yes, yes. This is a really interesting part of the dynamic between the two of them. Both Lodge, more so than Roosevelt, was desperate to become a politician. He caught the bug from Henry Adams, who introduced him to Republican politics around 1880, was involved in trying to find a candidate to be the Republican nominee. And Adams actually was concerned. He said, boy, everybody I introduce to politics who gets bitten by the bug, ends up on the ash heap of history in some form or another, because they get so consumed by the drive for power that inevitably consumes them and leads to somewhat of a depressing end. Um, Both Roosevelt and Lodge started out as reformers. I would argue that Theodore Roosevelt never left that idea of being a reformer. Lodge, who was always thinking 8, 10 steps ahead of everybody else, realized during the convention of 1884, when both men were obligated to support the nominee of the Republican Party, who was James Blaine, who both men despised, who both men believed was corrupt right down to his underwear, as Richard Nixon might have said about Helen Hagan Douglas. But both men ended up supporting Blaine, not because they wanted to, but because they believed it was their responsibility to do that. And this led to a real backlash, particularly with Henry Cabot Lodge, who was kind of drummed out of Boston society by the liberal Brahmin class, believing that Lodge had sold his soul for political gain as opposed to do what was right. Lodge, of course, had a terrible temper, and he never forgot this display of disrespect. But people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who supported Lodge through this turmoil, obviously was repaid with a seat on the Supreme Court. So if you were a friend of Henry Cabot Lodge's, he would stand with you shoulder to shoulder. If you crossed him, well, God help you. And fortunately, TR and he stood shoulder to shoulder, at least for most of their careers anyway. But both men started out as reformers. Lodge was a conservative. He believed in the Constitution as written. And this would come to play a significant role when we reach the moment, the Rubicon, as you could call it, of 1912, where things very much change.
And another very important topic from that time period. So, how do Roosevelt and Lodge support the expansion of American global power, influence, responsibility, even at the turn of the century, especially obviously with the Spanish American War?
Yeah, well, both men believed, and I'll pull a quote from Franklin Roosevelt, that the United States had a rendezvous with destiny. Both men believed that the United States was a unique creation, that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were unique, if not divinely inspired documents. And they believed that the United States had a unique role to play in the world. Both men understood and were very well versed in George Washington's farewell address, where Washington talks about this idea of expansion. And of course, by the time we get to the 1890s, the West has been closed, it's been fully populated. And so the only step one can take is to move abroad. And this is something that both Lodge and Roosevelt believe very passionately, along with Admiral Mahan and his book, Sea Power on Global History. All these men believe that the destiny of any great nation is to have a navy, and Lodge more so, not, I wouldn't say more so than Roosevelt, but certainly much more passionately, maybe, than Theodore Roosevelt, believed that the United States needed to have a foot in the Pacific, and this required the creation of a great navy and the opportunity to achieve some success and make some impact abroad. And this is, with the Spanish American War, was of course the ideal moment for the Lodge policy, known as the large policy, to be brought into the fore.
So, and you describe in the book how their friendship is tested in a lot of ways by their differing views of the expansion of government involvement, regulation, in the economy of society, especially when TR becomes president and Lodge is by that point in the Senate. So, can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, it's a very interesting uh, dynamic. There had been a lot of gossip within Washington circles where the relationship between Lodge and Roosevelt was referred to as the firm of Lodge and Roosevelt, right? I mean, Roosevelt was the junior man. He was 7 years younger than Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was known as the man who really was TR's mentor in a lot of ways, who encouraged TR's upward mobility, who wanted TR to achieve that political success. And he achieves this political success when McKinley is assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt has been, as he probably would say, rotting away in the vice presidency with little notice by Mark Hanna and or the late President McKinley in terms of offering him any kind of opportunity. And when TR becomes president, Lodge is obviously very happy, but a journalist inquires to Roosevelt, well, uh, obviously everybody is quite happy with your success, including Senator Lodge, but we're all wondering, how are you going to handle that relationship when people know how close you are, and are you in danger of perhaps giving too much favoritism to the senator from Massachusetts? And Roosevelt, without batting an eye, just simply looks at the journalist and says, no, 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 that's not the way it's done at all. Lodge does not run me, I run him. And it's a really powerful statement because it really does indicate that there has been a changing of the guard. in a sense, that Roosevelt is now president, Lodge is in the Senate. Roosevelt is now in control. He doesn't want anyone to ever forget it. But Lodge, I think, is very happy for TR. And he, in fact, writes Roosevelt at one point, I can go no further, meaning he is in the Senate. He's happy to be there, and he knows he doesn't have the capability, either the political ability or the desire to be president of the United States. But over time, we see these tensions grow because Lodge is as I said earlier, a hardcore constitutionalist, very much a believer in limited government, very much a believer in this idea that there are certain things within the Constitution that are unalterable, that should not and cannot be changed. And after Roosevelt returns to the arena, at the behest of Henry Cabot Lodge, I might add, because Lodge was the one who kept telling Roosevelt to come back after he finishes his term in office in 1908. And then Roosevelt shows his true progressive feathers when he starts proposing things like direct election of senators, the removal of judges by the voters if they're unhappy with decisions, the idea of eminent domain. If the state believes property needs to be seized for any sort of emergency whatsoever. And this causes Lodge to become pretty almost apoplectic because TR is doing things that Lodge had told him not to do. And it just drove Lodge completely crazy. And they have a break during the campaign of 1912, where Lodge writes TR a very passionate letter and says, you have no idea how you've hurt me. I thought you and I saw things the same way. Obviously, we don't. And I really don't know what to do. But I give Lodge some enormous credit. And I think this is something that we can learn today, that Lodge and Roosevelt severely disagreed about politics. And there was definitely some nasty talk between the two and about the two. But Lodge did not want their friendship to be destroyed because of politics. And so he backed off during the campaign of 1912. He would not involve himself in the primary between Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. He did, however, cause the Massachusetts primary to go Taft's way. I don't know what Roosevelt thought about that, if he knew Lodge had a hand in it. I really don't know. But Lodge was very clear. He said, our friendship is too important to be destroyed by petty political disagreements. And they eventually come back together over their mutual hatred of Woodrow Wilson and their desire to see America rearmed and sort of preparedness to become much more prominent than it had been earlier.
Right, and I'm just gonna agree with you that that would be a very good lesson for us to learn. Right, that you don't allow politics to interfere with good friendships. I think that's a great lesson. And so you mentioned World War One. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So what were their respective views towards Wilsonianism and preparedness versus neutrality, intervention in World War One? And I know Roosevelt dies, but even sort of the peace afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, they both sort of were essentially on the same ground in regard to preparedness. Roosevelt was livid and passionate about it. So was Henry Cabot Lodge. And in fact, Lodge's son-in-law, Augustus Peabody Gardner, who was in the Congress at the time, led a campaign to try to gain more awareness among the American people about the necessity for preparedness. But this feeling of isolationism, which is, of course, something that we see following the Great War and really dominating the post-war world, particularly all over the world, especially in the United States, it's very difficult for Roosevelt and Lodge to do anything. Eventually, as the war becomes more prominent, there is a bit of a trickle of public desire to become more involved in terms of preparing the nation for a potential war, Lodge and Roosevelt hated Woodrow Wilson. I mean, they really did. They hated him. They hated his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. They were both incompetent, weak. They were both weak sisters, so to speak, who were responsible, who could lead to the decline of this great, this great internationalism and this desire of expansion and to bring America into the global community as a force for good in the world. Roosevelt desperately wants to get back into combat. He desperately wants to take a regiment to France, even if it's through his own financial means and under the flag of of some independent flag of some kind. But Wilson stops him because obviously not only was Roosevelt quite he was more or less unwell in so many different areas, but also the idea of a former president of the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt, no less, fighting in France. Can you imagine what the publicity must have been like in comparison to Woodrow Wilson? I mean, it would be, certainly if Roosevelt wanted to make another try for the presidency, he would have probably been elected in a heartbeat. Of course, he didn't live long enough, and nor did he serve in the war, so it was sort of an irrelevant point. But the war was a hard one for both men. TR lost his beloved son Quentin. Lodge loses his son-in-law, Gus Gardner, during this period. So both men suffer the cold realities of war, and it really isn't a grand romantic gesture as they perhaps once thought when they were younger.
Absolutely fascinating. So, in a nutshell, what was the significance? What's the most important thing about this relationship of Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge in American history?
I think it's a couple of things. I think, first of all, Lodge really was responsible for helping Roosevelt rise far quicker. He got Roosevelt every single job other than Roosevelt's initial election to Congress. He got him the job in the Harrison Civil Service Commission. He got him the job as the police commissioner. He got him a job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he manipulated him and positioned him to become Vice President of the United States. Even when Roosevelt was complaining about how miserable his life was, Lodge actually wrote, "One cannot know what will happen in 4 years' time." And boy, was Henry Cabot Lodge prescient about that. The other thing I think goes back to my point about the whole friendship in politics, that Lodge knew that love he had for TR and the fellowship and the camaraderie the two had together, politics was nothing in comparison to the great experience these two men have had together. And thirdly, if you go to the National Portrait Gallery and you see those two great paintings of TR and Lodge, both done by John Singer Sargent, you can really get a sense that if two people have patience, perseverance, there's a little bit of timing and a little bit of luck involved, people do have the capacity to make a difference in American history.
Excellent. Well, a fascinating interview, a great book. Laurence Jurdem, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tony. It was such a privilege to be here, and thanks for letting me have the opportunity.
Great. The honor was all ours. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other interviews in our topics in American history on our channel. Thank you.